Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chuck Mohan. I'll be moderating this session. I would first like to ask if you can put your phones on vibrate, if you don't mind, okay? Just quickly about me, I'm a member of the May 1st Coalition. I was a trade unionist for over 13 years. Presently, I am an adjunct lecturer at the Borough of Manhattan Community College, teaching a course on American government. That's who I am. Our presenters here, I would first like to introduce Mike Gimbel, and let me make sure that we are all in the same session that you were supposed to be in. Dialectical Materialism versus the New Physics. Mike Gimbel. I also would like to show you, before I say anything about him, this is Mike's book, Dialectical Materialism versus the New Physics. And it's published by New Vista Publishers, if any of you are interested to get information on that.
It's on Amazon.com.
Yes. A little about Mike. He's a member of the May 1st Coalition for Workers and Immigrant Rights. He's the chair, Local 375 AFSCME, Labor Community Unity Committee. Retired executive board member of Local 375 and delegate to the New York City Central Labor Council from Local 375. Former consultant on player evaluation as an advisor to the general managers of Major League Baseball teams. He has written baseball player and team evaluation books and has been a speaker at a number of Society on American Baseball Research, SABR, conferences. Does statistical analysis of the unemployment figures published by the Department of Labor and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which he emails widely. Author of the book that I just showed you, Dialectical Materialism versus the New Physics. And above all, he's a red diaper baby from the 40s who never stopped fighting for a better world. Mike Gimbel. Second, our next presenter is, and someone was just looking at the books on that table right, well, that chair right there, but I'll mention it as we go along. Glenn Borchardt, PhD. He's the director, Progressive Science Institute, Berkeley, California. Glenn has 50 years of practical and theoretical experience in earth science. He has produced over 300 scientific reports, including journal articles, book material, and computer programs. He's the author of The Scientific Worldview and the 10 Assumptions of Science. We just hold it up so at least you could see. And Universal Cycle Theory. This is a little heavy, so I had to hold it separately. I'd like to ask that Mike Gimbel will present first, followed by Glenn, and then we will have a session for question and answers. Mike Gimbel.
Thank you, Chuck. Before I speak, I am a strong supporter of Workers' World Party. However, I am not a member of Workers' World Party. Therefore, what I say today should not be construed as the political position of Workers' World Party. What you hear today is completely my own opinion. I have been a lifelong communist, and I was shocked about 30 years ago to discover that today's physics is dominated by idealist and even religious thinking. I discovered that mathematics had improperly invaded and taken over physics and was being used to attack materialism. Why is this panel necessary for Marxists? Well, we all have imagination. Our imagination is useful in explaining the world we live in. The historical struggle between materialism and idealism is the struggle of science versus religion. Our imagination historically was dominated by the ghosts and angels and gods and devils and heaven and hell, and above all, of souls that can separate themselves from the body. And numbers like 666 were magical things. These were the ways that more primitive humans tried to explain the world as it existed. Today's more sophisticated humans are subjected to scientifically sounding nonsense that ignores real science and misuses the concept of infinity. Nonsense such as something called space-time, that is the product of math, not of observation. Time and space are merely the coordinates that we use to measure the motion of matter in relation to the motion of other matter. Nothing more. Time and space are not matter, nor a dimension of matter. Nonsensical beliefs about living in multi-dimensions and parallel universes, in curved space, in warped space, and in more wormholes and loops and knots in this magical space-time. Nonsensical belief in black holes, in the Big Bang, and in time travel. Nonsensical belief in the beginning and an end of time and space. Nonsensical belief in energy separate from matter, just like the soul separated from the body. Nonsensical belief in spheres with zero radius, or a point of zero size, or of objects with infinite density. Actual spheres cannot have a zero radius. Please show me that sphere. You can't do it. Infinite density is a misuse of the concept of infinity. Infinity is not a number. There is no such thing as infinite density. There's no such thing as infinite temperature or zero size. It is said that matter crosses the event horizon of a black hole cannot escape. That matter ends up in an infinitely dense singularity that increases the mass of the black hole. You cannot increase nor decrease the infinite. This violates basic math. This is mathematical illiteracy. Nonsensical belief in contradictory concepts such as massless particles and point particles. If a particle exists, it must have mass and it must be measurable in 3 dimensions. Nonsensical belief that there was an initial state of the universe, which is nothing more than the old religious belief in a God creating the universe. It is creationism in scientific garb. Nonsensical belief that mathematics could describe the mythical initial state of the universe. Nonsensical belief that the universe is a physical object that is expanding. Nonsensical belief in action at a distance, which is nothing more than belief in action without a cause. A violation of the most important law of physics, which is causality. Action at a distance is an appeal to magic, not to science. Unfortunately, this nonsense has become accepted as good science and is taught to breathless youths at the highest universities by men and women who are looked up to as almost godlike in their knowledge. This nonsense has become the Church of Relativity with a god named Einstein. The fight against the Church of Relativity is the modern struggle of science versus religion, of materialism versus idealism. This panel is a modest attempt at throwing the light of reality on this newest form of mysticism. This panel will link this fight for science with the class struggle against a reactionary capitalist ruling class. The very word revolutionary stems from the time of Galileo and Copernicus. The word revolutionary stems from the scientific proof that the Earth was revolving around the sun. Today's relativists are akin to yesterday's defenders of an Earth-centered Ptolemaic universe. Today's relativists deny that we live in a world filled with three-dimensional matter in continuous motion in the infinity of space and time. What has this panel got to do with the class struggle? Without an ideological understanding of reality, the struggle against capitalism and its ruling class cannot be victorious. To be a materialist requires understanding what matter is. The brain must lead the body. Activism without understanding reality is a losing strategy. Marxism has been proven over 150 years as the successful methodology for understanding and leading the class struggle. Dialectical materialism is the ideological basis of Marxism. Reading Marx without understanding Marx's methodology leads to failure to properly use Marxism in the class struggle. The dividing line between communism and social democracy is a thread that leads from the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution to the Chinese Cultural Revolution, the two greatest revolutions in human history, and thence to the overthrow of the Soviet Union, the greatest calamity in the history of the working class struggle to defeat capitalism. The war in the Balkans, the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, the NATO destruction of Libya, and the current imperialist-sponsored destruction of Syria, as well as the attacks on the labor movements from Greece to the United States, are all the result of the final bureaucratic degeneration and final overthrow of the Soviet Union. The catastrophic overthrow of the Soviet Union and the worker states in Eastern Europe and the misunderstanding on the left of the class character of the Soviet Union has negatively impacted the study of dialectical materialism. This must be corrected. Without understanding dialectical materialism, one cannot understand Marxism. Materialism is viewed by the capitalist ruling class as another name for Marxism. As such, the ruling class uses religious and idealist thinking to oppose materialist thinking. The right wing, the religious right-wing creationist attack on evolution is a primary example that most thinking people recognize as a reactionary religious attack on science. However, relativity is another attack on materialism, but is not understood as such. As I said before, the Big Bang Theory is creationism in scientific clothing. It is creation ex nihilo in new garb. With the overthrow of the Soviet Union in 1991, the ruling class had an open field to turn back the clock on all the workers' gains all over the world that have been made since 1970, the Bolshevik Revolution. Ever since Gorbachev quickened the pace of market reforms that had been begun decades earlier, and the resultant overthrow of the Soviet Union, workers have been on the defensive all over the world. The invasion of Iraq in 1991, the same year, was a direct result of the end of the worker states from 1989 through the overthrow of the Soviet Union in 91. The coincidental date of the attack on Iraq at the same time is not an accident. The US had, on several occasions, threatened over the years to invade Iraq, but was prevented from doing so because the Soviet Union threatened to go to nuclear war. In 1991, the US saw its opportunity to invade Iraq and did it. The subsequent war in the Balkans, the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq for the second time, the destruction of Libya, the current destruction of Syria can directly be ascribed to the overthrow of the Soviet Union. The same goes for all the attacks on labor here in the United States and all over the world. The gains by labor worldwide were concessions won from the ruling class who feared communism during that period. That is why after the overthrow of the Soviet Union, the ruling class proclaimed the end of history. It is not the end of history. It is the beginning of a new stage in the class struggle. It is vital that the new activist worker leaders and fighters in the class struggle should study the history of the Soviet Union and the ideology that created the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was, regardless of all its defects, the greatest victory of the working people against the ruling class in the history of the world. That's why the world's ruling classes united to defeat the Soviet Union in the Cold War. There were great triumphs in the Soviet Union and similar great mistakes. All must be studied. Without understanding and studying the history of the Soviet Union, we cannot learn how to avoid those same mistakes that were made there, nor learn what was successful there that we can use. The Soviet Union, while it existed, was the actual base of the worldwide workers' movement. That is why the ruling class gave so many concessions to the workers here and around the world while it existed, and why they're taking it back now that it doesn't exist. For instance, if the AFL-CIO were destroyed here, what would happen to the workers here? Well, in some sense, the Soviet Union was like the AFL-CIO with state power. Yes, bureaucratic, but still a workers' organization. The overthrow of the Soviet Union therefore was a disaster for workers everywhere. Throwing out the Soviet Union's remarkable history as if it were some unintelligible mistake will be like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. How and why did relativity become an instrument of the ruling class in its struggle against materialism? Until Einstein, the ether was understood to exist and was the basis for scientific experimentation. The ether was the only way to understand, for instance, how light acted as a wave. A wave, by definition, required a medium to propagate the wave. Therefore, space could not be empty. Maxwell based his equations on the existence of the ether. Michelson and Morley did their experiments based on the existence of the ether. Einstein has played games all over the place in terms of his interpretation about those, but generally speaking, tries to deny the existence of the ether. And this ends up with that light could travel through nothing. Michelson and Morley, along with Dayton Miller, the president of the American Physical Society, continued to run the original Michelson and Morley experiments, and they proved the existence of the ether, which falsified Einstein's theories, but the results have been ignored. Numerous other experiments and studies have also falsified Einstein's theories. Who was Einstein, and why has his theories survived despite being falsified repeatedly? Einstein was the head of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, Germany, at the time of the overthrow of Kaiser Wilhelm on November 28, 1918. Einstein was a pacifist who personally opposed World War I, but also was an anti-communist. Arthur Eddington, who is the one who so-called confirmed Einstein's theory, also was a pacifist who personally opposed World War I and insisted on keeping the communications open with the German scientist Einstein during World War I. Eddington was the scientist who falsely claimed confirmation of Einstein's theory of relativity in May of 1919, 6 months after the overthrow of Kaiser Wilhelm. The year 1919, immediately after the overthrow of Kaiser Wilhelm, was the greatest turning point in the world's history, and the greatest turning point in the history of the class struggle ever. Armed and angry soldiers were outraged at the slaughter of World War I, and the ruling classes everywhere around the world thought it was all over for them. The leaders of this 1917 Bolshevik Revolution were just trying to hold on to power until a victorious German Revolution would come to their rescue. Germany, and Berlin in particular, was the center of that worldwide struggle. All the world's eyes from all over the world were watching Berlin, because the future of the world was being determined at that point. The workers had seized Germany. They had control when they overthrew the Kaiser, but they had no organization. There was no Communist Party. They had no organizational party to lead them. The German ruling class thought they were beaten. The Social Democratic Party, which had betrayed the workers at the beginning of the war, had lost all credibility amongst the workers. But that, because of the situation, they became the German ruling class's primary political organization against the seizure of power of the German workers. Einstein, at this critical moment in history, became a founder of the newly created German Democratic Party. At this critical moment, and in Berlin. The German Democratic Party was to the right of the Social Democratic Party, but to the left of the ultra-nationalists. The German Democratic Party was the party that wrote the Weimar Constitution. The primary financier of the German Democratic Party, Hjalmar Schacht, later became Hitler's banker as the Reichsminister of Economics before being succeeded by Hermann Goering in 1937. The German Social Democratic Party brought in the German Freikorps to put down the workers of Berlin. The Freikorps were bitter, ultra-nationalist soldiers who viewed the workers as traitors that caused Germany to lose the war. The Freikorps later became the vanguard of the Nazi movement. January 1919, just 2 months after the overthrow of the Kaiser, saw the first Battle of Berlin, where the workers were defeated. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were assassinated that month as a result. 2 months later, in March of 1919, saw the second Battle of Berlin, where the workers again were defeated by the Freikorps. 2 months later, in May 1919, came Eddington's false confirmation of the theory of relativity in May of 1919. What did this confirmation have to do with the struggle in Berlin? Vladimir Lenin was the leader of the world revolution against capitalists, the ruling classes. All the eyes were on this struggle, and Lenin was the leader. And Lenin had written a book in 1908 attacking relativity. The title of that book is Materialism and Imperial Criticism. To believe that it is just a coincidence that the worldwide ruling class battle against communism that was led by Lenin in the critical year of 1919, which struggle was centered in Berlin, and where Einstein was directly politically involved, and where relativity theory was in direct conflict with Lenin's ideology of dialectical materialism, would be to ignore reality. Relativity theory was therefore thrust forward in the ruling class's fight against communism. Relativity theory is a ruling class tool to keep our brains filled with nonsensical ideas that will keep us confused and helpless. Relativity theory is an attack on basic physical laws. Imagine that I have a ball in my hand. I drop the ball and it bounces up, down again. The basic law of physics involves that a body in motion cannot change its direction of motion unless an external force acts on it. You know what happened at the bottom when it hit the floor, right? Or hit the top of a table, or whatever. You can see that. What happened at the other side? Did the ball get tired? Did a hand reach out from the floor and pull it down? No. What happened is a ball cannot change its direction on its own. It has to be impinged by matter hitting it. No such thing as action at a distance.
Gravity.
That's it. But what is gravity? You can't say it's right
The
a word.
geometry of space.
Okay, let's
Yes.
get that into the discussion, okay?
Well, but that's real.
No, that's not.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Do you deny gravity? You really...
No, I'm not.
One second,
Please,
one
let me
second.
finish.
Please let him finish his presentation and all those questions will come up. Thank you.
The theory of gravity involving something called action at a distance is a violation of causality, which is the most important law of physics. Newton was not a proponent of action at a distance, as it is claimed. Action at a distance is another word for magic, not science. Newton, in regard to the idea of action at a distance, stated that this idea is, quote, so great an absurdity that I believe that no man who has in philosophical matters a competent facility of thinking can ever fall into it, unquote. And Newton also stated, quote, you sometimes speak of gravity as essential and inherent in matter. Pray do not ascribe that notion to me, for the cause of gravity is what I do not pretend to know, unquote. The second law of thermodynamics is being misused to justify bogus theories about the eventual big freeze where the universe will cool down to absolute zero. The second law only applies to a closed system, like this room. Space is not a closed system, space is infinite. The law of the conservation of matter means that matter has always been present because matter cannot be created out of nothing nor destroyed. It can only be transformed into other matter in motion. Therefore, by definition of a basic law of physics, there cannot be a beginning of time where there was no matter. Time is not a thing. It is simply how we measure the distance matter moves relative to other matter in motion. Time cannot be different for different objects in motion, as the relativists claim. To claim that time is different for different objects is to deny our ability to measure the relative motion of these different objects. Without an agreed upon universal measurement of that motion of time, no science is possible. Einstein stated, quote, for us convinced physicists, the distinction between past, present, and future is an illusion, although a persistent one. Oh, really? And you want us to believe this nonsense? That statement means that Einstein did not believe in change, that events are preordained. Isn't that a religious, not a scientific statement from Einstein? Time is not a thing. Only material objects are things. Things have a beginning and an end. Things like the chair you are sitting on can be created or destroyed. Time, space, and the universe are not things that can be perceived by any of our senses. We can locate matter in motion at physical locations in time and space and the universe, nothing more. The past is past. The future, by definition, can never be now. The future must always remain in the future. But now is just a moment we are passing through. You cannot point to now. For to do so, it would already be in the past. We move through now, but can never point to now. Only things exist. Matter in motion exists. Matter moves through the infinity of space and time. In fact, the meaning of infinity is nothing. In is no, Finite is something that can be counted. An apple, you. Therefore, it's a thing. So infinity, no thing, nothing. You cannot, for instance, where they talk about, cool down from an infinite temperature. Well, if I subtract 1 trillion degrees from infinite temperature, what do you have? An infinite temperature. You can't subtract, multiply, divide, or anything from infinity.
That's not true.
It's not a number.
That's a false claim. It's false. Yeah.
It's not a number, please. The illusion of time and space as things created by our... the illusion of time and space as things is created by our ability to specify the location in time and space where events happen. But a location is not a thing. It is where an event occurred in space and time, nothing more. Time as the fourth dimension is a product of math, not of reality. Math can use 1 dimension, 2 dimensions, 4 dimensions, or as many dimensions as you can imagine. Reality, however, exists only in 3 dimensions.
Why?
Okay.
How are you so sure?
We'll get to the discussion. Please. I'm almost summing up here. Marxism-Leninism is the ideology of successful revolutions. I urge serious revolutionaries to study the history of the Bolshevik Revolution. Every subsequent successful working-class revolution based itself on the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, including China, Cuba, and Vietnam. If you think that you can make a revolution without a serious study of the past efforts at revolution, you will be making a tragic mistake that will make it that much more difficult to actually make the revolution that you so desire. Even if you are by chance momentarily able to seize power, then what? How would this most complicated society in the history of the world function under your leadership if you had no knowledge of history and of social movements and class struggle? Revolution sounds romantic, but in actuality it is a great burden that requires serious people in leadership who have discussed every possible variant and researched previous events that would give them additional knowledge. Knowledge is power. There is no better test experiment in worker power than the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. I urge you to seriously study that test. I urge you to take a dialectical materialist, not a static materialist, position on the USSR and China. The static materialist looks at a particular event, such as the changing of the word of the Constitution of the USSR from the dictatorship of the proletariat to the state of the whole people, completely out of context with the reality of the then economic structure of the Soviet Union, and claims that this was the moment when capitalism triumphed. Is that Marxism? No. The history of the USSR, from the seizure of power by the workers in 1917 to the physical counter-revolution and overthrow of the workers' power in 1991, was a dialectical process of ever-growing bureaucratic degeneration in the Soviet Union that started on day one of the 1917 revolution. Lenin's fight to defend the Soviet Union from imperialist and internal counter-revolution, and Lenin's simultaneous fight against the bureaucratic degeneration of the first worker state needs to be studied and understood. I urge you to read Lenin and Trotsky, the two primary leaders of the 1917 revolution. In particular, Lenin's Materialism and Imperial Criticism, and Trotsky's In Defense of Marxism. Both these books are defenses and explanations of dialectical materialism. One should also read Engels' explanation of dialectical materialism in his book, Anti-Dueling. I urge you also to read 3 works of Sam Marcy that are critical to understanding today's world. 1, China, the Struggle Within. 2, China, the Suppression of the Left. And 3, Perestroika. As I said, the brain must lead the body. Organizing against capitalism requires understanding our dialectically changing world. This gives us, the working class, a tool, an ideological tool that is much more powerful than any ideological tool that the ruling class possesses. Finally, defense of the Soviet Union. From 1917 through 1991, defense of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, defense of what remains of workers' power in China, and defense of Syria against imperialist aggression are what separates communists from social democracy. It all comes down to the old slogan, which side are you on?
Thank you, Mike. Thank you.
Q&A.
One second.
Q&A, please.
1 second, please. 1 second. Listen. Wait. Excuse me. Let's be civil to each other. For those of you who came in late, I mentioned before, we will have both presentations and then we will open for question and answers. And I understand that you're anxious to ask, and it's okay, but give us a chance for our next presenter. Okay? Glenn Borchardt, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck, and thanks, Mike, for inviting me here. I was impressed with Mike's book. In fact, you can see my little quote on the cover. And it's very rare that I ever find someone who thinks like I do, and there's a few. We have a group called the Natural Philosophy Alliance, and we have a couple hundred members in the U.S. These are folks who are opposed to the relativity and Big Bang theory. Worldwide, we have something like 7,000 people that are opposed. Now, you don't hear about this very much because you know how things go.
Well, there's always a
Working on the lab. Now, unlike most other scientific disciplines, physics and cosmology are heavily theory-laden. And in the earth sciences, in which I labored for over 50 years, we don't question the assumption that there are material causes for all effects. We have our feet on the ground. And so I was shocked when I found out, wow, there's more than 3 dimensions? And in fact, the only C I ever got in college was in Physics 1A, where they talked about relativity and so forth. I just couldn't get it. And then I took 1B later on from an 83-year-old gentleman. I took this course in the summer. It was classical mechanics, got an A+. That was the difference. I just could not jump across those assumptions. And so I couldn't figure out why they were making all these proclamations, and how could they happen? Why? Why did they exist? The universe exploding out of nothing? Come on. How can there be an end to the universe? Okay, in satisfying this curiosity, I learned a few things that have led me here today. Okay, being a materialist by occupation, that's what I was doing. I was drawn to dialectical materialism, which was all rage in the 60s and 70s, and some even called it the scientific worldview. And this was certainly a different way of looking at the world than I had experienced. My dad was a big follower of Joe McCarthy. He came from Wisconsin. I was religious for 20 years, the most conservative of religion. So, absent Marx, I had no idea that there was even a pattern to history. I thought it was all a big blur of events and so on. And what Marx was saying is, look at, there's a progression here from feudalism to capitalism to socialism. I said, what? Really? Well, that was interesting. So, and he talked about a spiralic process. Remember the negation of negation, one of the laws that Engels came out. Whenever there's a turn in the spiral, it doesn't go back just the way it was before, but there's an additional change. So there's a spiral to progress, and that was new to me. Anyway, this cosmology stuff just didn't make any sense to me at all. So Marx's method, of course, later called dialectical materialism, historical materialism, emphasized it was not consciousness that determined conditions, but conditions that determine consciousness. Okay, that was kind of a shock to me too, because I always thought, what is consciousness? 20th century physicists, like their compatriots in the rest of the bourgeoisie, were heavily influenced by remnants of feudalism and the most explosive phase of capitalist development. Like the still religious folk that dominate the electorate, most physicists were raised on feudalistic beliefs in creation and the soul, which is matterless motion, as far as I can tell. the paradoxes and contradictions wrought by relativity, and there are plenty of them, you know. There's the twin paradox, wave-particle duality. Those were accepted by these folks because if you're religious, you have a lot of contradictions to deal with. Walking on water, virgin birth, living after dying, those are little contradictions, right? So this is where these people are coming from. That's where I came from. You don't have to be an atheist to be a scientist. You may become one, but you don't have to be one. And that was no accident that the Big Bang Theory was promulgated during the greatest capitalist expansion the world has ever known. Is that just an accident? I don't know. The assumptions that underlay the idea that capitalist growth was inevitable and perpetual, and that one lived after dying were compatible with a new physics and cosmogony. I call it, you know, cosmogony is cosmology that assumes the beginning. Okay, with infinity, I'm an infinite universe guy, but with the Big Bang, that assumes the beginning, right? But it took the, let's see, the assumptions that underlay the idea that capital, okay, then, but because of the fog of bourgeois propaganda, it took me quite a while to sort all this stuff out. And like I said, I was quite interested in this because I just couldn't get it. And you know about Engel's three laws. The first is unity and conflict of opposites. I used that. And the transformation of quantity into quality. And again, like I said, negation, negation. These were good. They were nice, but they weren't enough. Okay, and that's why these books came about. The 10 Assumptions of Science, that's where they come from. So it was surprising that the idealist philosopher Robin Collingwood said a lot of nonsense, but he did say some really good advice. He said, fundamental assumptions always have opposites, and they're not provable. And if you hold more than one, they have to be consuponable. That is, and you probably know, you've never heard this word before, unless you read my stuff, and his consuponable means that if you can hold one assumption, you can hold the other without contradiction. Those are the three criteria I use. And I said, look, at every paradigm, like the Big Bang, has its foundation and its assumptions. Even Kuhn talked about that in The Structure of Scientific Revolution. Well, anyway, he had this written up in his essay on metaphysics, and I passed it up at the Berkeley Library about 3 times, because when I hear metaphysics, as a scientist, bullshit, right? Well, anyway, this is some really great ideas that he brought up, and so I went ahead and I said, okay, let's see what assumptions are being made, because they're not, I don't think they're the ones that I would hold. Okay, so after a bunch of research, I came up with the 10 assumptions of science. Now you can have one assumption, you can have 1,000. I picked 10 for, you know, I was religious. 10 was a good number. And so I divided all the philosophical propositions into 2 opposing categories, deterministic and indeterministic. Remember I said, determinism says that there are material causes for all effects. Indeterminism says, no, some effects may not have material causes. Okay? All right, so that's the foundation of all religions. Determinism just being the opposite. So I split things that way. Now, I have to disagree a little bit with Mike. He says, well, that's materialism versus idealism, and that's the standard way we do it in dialectical materialism. I couldn't do that. As a scientist, we use idealism all the time. For example, we think like between you and I is empty space, right? And then I'm solid matter. Well, in truth, there is no empty space. That's an idea. There is no solid matter. There can't be. What there is always in between. But those idealizations are really important, because otherwise I couldn't get around this room. I got to find the empty space to get out the door, which I'll probably have to do when this gets going. So I say this, there are causes for all effects, right? And that means all effects. It means everything in your brain as well. There is no, under this belief, there is no free will, because everything must be caused. Everything has a cause and effect. So one of the problems I had with Engels is that he has a nice little thing in Dialectics of Nature saying, there is free will, right? And I say, that's not going to do it for me. So that's why I put this whole thing in the terms of determinism. And the progression was this way, 10 assumptions in here, and then I used the 10 assumptions for the scientific worldview, which has a subtitle, Understanding the Universal Mechanism of Evolution, and I'm going to get into that. This is beyond Newton and Einstein, and I'll be getting into that when I talk about the assumptions. Let me go through those assumptions a little bit, and then some of this is going to be really hard for you to understand, because if you're on a track, say you believe that there was truly empty space, or the universe was finite, you are going to have a hard time with this, because you need to do a revolution in your own mind. Okay? If you switch from infinity, which is the Big Bang, to infinity, that's a 180-degree revolution. It's not a complete revolution, because you're back where you started from. But that is really a big deal. And that's what I'm all about. I want to educate people to make that kind of change. Once you make that kind of change, you will be flip-flopping on a lot of stuff, not just on infinity and infinity. Now remember, materialism is the first assumption of science. You got to have matter first. And I state it this way: the external world exists after the observer does not. Remember I said you can't prove this. You can't prove it unless you die, and in which case you're not going to be telling us about it. That's what materialism. Now, immaterialism is the belief that, like I said, that matter is not, there's other things besides matter. But what's the definition of a thing? A thing has X, Y, Z dimensions and location with respect to other things. That's what matter is. And so that's where we come off with materialism. Now, matter per se doesn't exist. Remember, we always talk about matter. There are only examples of matter. Matter is an abstraction. Remember, it's like fruit. You can't eat a fruit. The only thing you can eat is, say, an apple, an orange, a specific fruit. So that the opposite of immaterialism is that the universe is an illusion or internal perception that wouldn't exist without a perceiving being. A little bit like Einstein, right? Humans often behave in ways that reflect immaterial beliefs. For example, infants sometimes cover their heads with blankets and they make the rest of the world disappear. And adults have doubts about whether that tree falling in the woods really made a noise or not. And modern physicists often follow Einstein in claiming that gravity nonetheless is caused by an immaterial field. This field is mathematical. It's got no matter in it. It's immaterial. It don't matter. How can that work? And gravity is still a mystery to most people. Nonetheless, the widespread belief in materialism led to the formal use of observation and experiment as the arbiters of truth, not only in science but also in a legal system and as well in secular society. My analysis assumes the universe operates materially regardless of our ability to detect anything at all. And the most important observation any scientist ever made was Newton's first law, which says that an object in motion stays in motion, right, like you were talking, unless it's acted on by another object. Now that's just, for that, you're not talking about causality at all. All you're talking about is the motion, the inertia of the object. The second assumption of science actually gives motion to matter, and that's causality, like Mike was saying. And I have a little bit of a different take on it. Classical mechanics believed in finite causality. So there was always a finite number of causes to produce an effect. And the big problem with that is it didn't work. It worked partly, but it didn't work perfectly. So I have proposed that causality is this, to be written this way: all effects have an infinite number of material causes. You see, this fits in with the possibility of ether, an infinite subdivision of matter. And that's why we always get a plus or minus on every analysis we do. I used to do a lot of lab work, and I would try to control my system. I always got a plus or minus. Why was that? Because there were an infinite number of causes involved. It wasn't just maybe ether, it could be the temperature, this and that, and so forth, but you never had a finite number. Nobody's ever had any analysis without a plus or minus. The third assumption of science is uncertainty. Now this is consequential with this form of causality. Uncertainty, as I stated, is It is impossible to know everything about anything, but it's always possible to know more about anything. You see how that fits with the infinity? It's Kant's upon. So you can study anything, this book, and I can find out more and more about. There's no end to it. If you study souls like I did, you put it under a microscope, and there's all kinds of stuff there, and then you bring up the and it's more and more and more. And this is really, really important interpretation. Now, the current interpretation is called the Copenhagen view, which is sort of the opposite. And it says that uncertainty is objective. And again, they're trying to save the classical mechanics of Laplace's demon. Laplace's demon was supposedly able to predict the future perfectly. It's not going to happen. Why? Because it's infinite. And it never did. The demon would have to spend all his time just doing one prediction if he wanted to get it perfectly. So he could predict the future completely. You're not going to do it. And uncertainty is often associated with the concept of randomness or chance. And there's three ways of viewing chance. One is as a sign of acausality, another as a singular cause, and also, like I said, as a sign of observer ignorance. And that's the one we picked. The others, you can, and the indeterminists will believe those sorts of things, but I don't. The fourth assumption is inseparability. Now, this is what was lost with relativity. This is Hegel's dictum. It says that just as there is no motion without matter, so there is no matter without motion. Doesn't that make sense? Well, let's keep it that way. Our discussion will all be involved with stuff that's in motion, none of this matterless motion stuff. It's a little bit hard, though, for people to understand. Because to understand it, you have to realize that there is no connection between motion and matter. You know what a connection is? Here's a connection between these two books. There is no connection. It's what matter does. Now, the physicists in the room will not know what time is. The propaganda in regard to relativity says that time is a dimension, a measurement, whatever. Time is motion. That's what I liked about Mike's stuff. Time is motion, and the average person doesn't even have a clue, and certainly not a modern physicist, because you are taught. That's what they were trying to teach me. It didn't work. They were trying to teach me that time was, like I say, a measurement, whatever. It's not. It's motion. That's all it is. It doesn't exist. It's not part of the universe. It's what parts of the universe do. This is very difficult for people to understand. I realize that. But see, conceptually, you have to separate matter and motion so that you can understand how they work. That's what you have to do. Now, there are a couple of mistakes you can make with regard to interconnection, or with inseparability. One is that matter could exist without motion. And we dispelled that with the plate tectonic theory, right? Got that going. That motion could occur without matter. Well, we didn't quite get rid of that one because this is what you're talking about with a little bit of Einstein stuff. And that matter is motion. Again, it's not true. And that motion is matter. Those are some of the mistakes that are made. One of the main errors that Einstein had was what I call his main philosophical error, and that's the objectification of motion. Objectification of motion is when you consider motion to be a thing. Like we all say, we have things to do. No, you don't. What you have is activities to do. We don't have to think, but we do that all the time. We say, we have saved enough time for you. And if anybody thinks that time is matter like that, please give me some because I'm needing it for my next book. He objectified time, Einstein objectified time in special relativity as length. He objectified light as matter. And like Mike was saying, I agree that light is not matter, it is the motion of matter. You have to have a medium for that. It's like Sound. Sound is what? Is sound matter? If Einstein was doing the work, he called the little things that I'm putting out sound-ons, like he called the photon in light. But that's not what sound is. Sound is the motion, the vibration of air or anything else. There's a couple other things. The association between matter and motion appears in many laws of physics. And for shorthand, we use laws like momentum, for example, which is P equals mv, mass times velocity. Now, does momentum exist? Think about it. Mass times
Yes,
velocity.
it does, yes.
It does not exist.
Yes, it
And
does.
what exists is the matter.
Right,
So when
and
I
the
get
product exists.
when I get hit,
Yes, I'm answering.
when I get hit by the tackle playing football, I got hit by the tackle. I didn't get hit by any momentum. But if I want to know how big a hit that is, I got to know he's 300 pounds and how fast he's moving, right? So that's all it is. But it's a shorthand. It's a calculation. And the same thing is true for force. Force is ma, mass times acceleration. Force doesn't exist. Right now, the physicists are arguing about the four forces. What they're talking about is different kinds of motion of matter. That's all they do. Energy is the same thing. What is energy? E equals mc squared. M, the mass part, c, the motion part. So what we have here is a matter-motion term. It's a hyphenated. Matter-motion terms are used all the time in physics. But we forget what we're doing with them. We sort of like this. It's matter exists and motion occurs. These equations are like pictures of the running dog. They're not the running dog. There's a difference. That's what we have to know if we're going to do any kind of analysis of what's going on here. Conservation is matter, and the motion of matter can be neither created nor destroyed. Notice I didn't put energy in there because energy doesn't exist, but matter does, and the motion occurs. All right? So that's conservation. Now the opposite, of course, is creation. And that's what's being assumed in cosmogonies. You're creating something from nothing, and that's the opposite. So remember, there's always an opposite to each of these assumptions that I use. That's how my analysis proceeded. Now, the sixth assumption of science is complementarity. And you all heard of second law of thermodynamics, or should have by now. Remember, that's one that predicts the heat death of the universe. And the way I interpret it is this. Complementarity says that all bodies are subject to divergence and convergence from other bodies. That only works in an infinite universe. One reason they're using the second law, because they have a finite universe. They have used systems philosophy, which is the current bourgeois philosophy of science, as the archetype of all of systems. Here you make the whole universe thing. Remember, in science, what we do is we do systems philosophy. We draw a sphere around whatever we're studying, and we get all the data and stuff, and then we make grand pronouncements about stuff. And that's typical error of systems philosophy. So complementarity is what I call this. Essentially is it says that, remember, the indeterminists will say that there's only the second law and no complement to it. I tried to get this published back in 1980 in Science. They didn't like it. I think I've got 2 papers rejected out of about 300, and that was one of them. But of course, it's controversial, and you get the right editor, and you don't get through. So this is the yin and yang of the whole universe. Things are always coming apart, like your house does if you don't attend to it, and things are coming together in another place. So anything that comes off of here, falls off your house, ends up in the ground. Now this is why it was always curious to me why the universe is supposed to be from a big bang. Now if you create something, you make something, how do you do it? There's a convergence. You get the hammer, you want to build a house, hammer, nails, plaster, cement. You bring things together. You don't bring them apart. This is silly. I mean, that's it. But people believe in the Big Bang all over the place. The explosion of something out of nothing.
What if you're digging a hole?
But we'll do it. I've done that too, and I was making it. Okay, the seventh assumption of science is irreversibility. All processes are irreversible. That is, it's impossible to go back in time. Sorry for you guys that wanted to do that. And I think, like Mike was saying, those former periods don't exist. The future doesn't exist. But I was at this one meeting where this fellow was a believer in Einstein, and he swore that the occasion of my birth existed, but I didn't. I didn't hang around with him much more. Now, the eighth assumption of science is infinity, and I bring this up a little bit later because remember we have to start out with certain things like materialism first, causality, and so on. But what I say here is the universe is infinite both in the microcosmic and macrocosmic directions. And without infinity, the 10 assumptions wouldn't exist. Remember, they're all conceptual. You try to do your own set of assumptions, good luck. Unless you include infinity, it isn't going to work. Of course, various thinkers have had two different types of infinity. One, Aristotle thought that everything was infinitely subdividable, and but the macro was not. And then Newton had just the opposite. Remember, Newton's object was solid. Solid matter, there's nothing in it. It was one of the problems. Like all the atomists. Remember, they had a little atoms going around. They're all identical. They're all solid. Why would they even join up at all? There's nothing there to do that. But anyway, that's what infinity is all about. So I use both that it's microcosmic infinite and macrocosmic infinite. That's kind of about how this book came about. A universal cycle theory I wrote with Steve Pitts. He's a genius in statistics and math. And he essentially, and I, worked out what we call the neo-mechanics of the hierarchically infinite universe. And as you know, atoms are little vortices, and the solar system's a vortex, things spinning around things. And then there's the Milky Way galaxy does that, and then there are galactic clusters that do that. And now we're finding that there's a general drift of clusters in one direction. So we have hypothesized in this thing a megavortex, a local megavortex. This is our observable universe right here. This is going around the net. Some people have called this the great attractor or whatever. And we have some ideas in here about gravitation. While we were working on this book, I think we came up with, we thought it was really a great idea. It essentially has ether pressure is greater away from massive objects than near them because of the interaction of ether and matter. And then we looked into optics. Newton's book, a fellow finally mentioned it, the same idea was in there. And you mentioned about Newton's idea or attraction or something like that. That's the one they push. But they don't push what he actually came up with, came very, very close to what gravity really is. And so if you're interested in this kind of stuff, get this book. It's only $60. Yeah, but you can get it from Kindle for $10. So people have done that. Yeah. Let me kick along here a little bit. The ninth assumption of science is relativism. Now let's think about this one. All things have characteristics that make them similar to other things, as well as characteristics that make them dissimilar to other things. Now, absolutists don't believe that. They believe in absolute identities. This is common in things, like Plato or whatever, ideal forms and so forth, as actually being existing. Relativism says that. The 10th assumption of science is interconnection. All things are interconnected, and what I say is that between any two objects exist other objects that transmit matter and motion. You see how that fits with infinity? Subdividable and so on. We use that to good effect in here. This guy came up to me, and I actually got a hold of him. He has all these cycles that are applicable, and he's trying to figure out, make sense of them. Why do they relate to each other as well as they do? And that's what we did. And interconnection was it. So he has cycles from a billion years to days. Okay, now I'm going to wrap this up with what my philosophy is. It's called univironmental determinism. Now you remember I had mentioned the Marx quote saying that it isn't consciousness that determine conditions, but conditions that determine consciousness. And that's sort of like environmental determinism. It's sort of like an overemphasis on the conditions and less emphasis on consciousness. Now, I'm sure many people have changed that for political reasons. But remember that the current scientific worldview is systems philosophy, and it replaced classical mechanics. The first, which was the first worldview, scientific worldview. Systems philosophy tends to overemphasize the insides of things, and classical mechanics tends to overemphasize the outsides of things. So here's Marx doing the same thing. Remember what Darwin came up with, natural selection. He was emphasizing the outsides of his model, his subject. And of course this was changed, because once they found genes, they had to include the insides of the model. And so now we have the mechanism of evolution is neo-Darwinism. It is the combination of these two. The only problem with that, for me, being a soil scientist, earth scientist, I see evolution all the time. I work on the evolution of soils. I'm supposed to know whether a soil's 11,000 years old or 20 or 50. So I said, look at, we need a mechanism that's not just neo-Darwin, only works in biology. We need a mechanism for evolution that is useful in everything. And that's why I came up with this word univironmental with my friend Elizabeth. Remember I said environmental determinism was the verge of what Marx is saying there. Univironment is the combination of the system, thing, and its environment. See why I need an infinite universe? Whatever happens, this is what it says. Univironmental determinism says, whatever happens to a portion of the universe is determined by the matter in motion, the infinite matter in motion inside it, and the infinite matter in motion outside. There are all kinds of infinities, so don't go off on that one. That's what univironmental determinism is. You can analyze any portion of the universe that way, and you will be correct, except you have two problems. One is you may overemphasize the microcosmic, which I call a microcosmic mistake, or you might overemphasize the macrocosmic, and that's a macrocosmic mistake. So in science, what we try to do, not make mistakes, because as a scientist, they don't like to pay you for making a mistake. So you always have to get this proper balance. And I think that's what we need to do in social movements as well. Let's see. So anyway, let me get to the quick here, wrap this up. So how does this help us understand regressive physics? And I call this regressive physics, because we're talking a step back, away from materialism, to what Einstein and the Big Bang theorists are doing. Well, it should be pretty clear by now that physicists work in a particular environment that has a tremendous effect on their consciousness. If you were brought up with indeterministic assumption of creation, you might not object to cosmogony, the assumption that the universe was finite and had a beginning. If you believed in the Holy Ghost and in souls, you might not object to other physicists' claims of matterless motion. If you believed in absolutes of any sort, you might believe in the constancy of the speed of light, which is now being questioned. I guess you probably heard about that. That'll go back and get it constant again, but that's one example. There are no constants in it. There are no constants in nature. We have a whole chapter on that here. There are no constants, period. Everything is relative. That's the only thing we agree on with Einstein. Everything is in motion with respect to everything else. Universal time is the motion of everything with respect to everything else. Specific time is always measured by a clock. So if I have a clock that's here, or an hourglass, I can measure that specific time. But, like I said, universal time is there. You can't measure universal time. Okay, at the Progressive Science Institute, we have produced a detailed critique of today's regressive physics. That little card I handed out has the scientificphilosophy.com website, and I encourage you to take a look at that, and you'll get some idea of what's going on. I'll have to just state these 9 claims here, or whatever, and then you'll have to decide whether they fit your cup of tea or not. The universe did, first of all, point number 1, the universe did not explode out of nothing. The universe is not expanding. The redshift is the result of wave motion of light over distance. And nothing travels for far without something happening to it. I don't know what's happening to the light, but it ain't getting there. It's being redshifted every time. The universe will not die. Heat death is claimed by any deterministic interpretation of the second law. from their finite assumption. Gravitation is a push, not a pull. That's what Mike was saying, and I thought, well, that's pretty good. And in this book, that's exactly what we come up with. Momentum, force, and energy do not exist. They are calculations. Time is motion. There is an ether from which ordinary matter has formed. We could talk about that more if you want. There is no wave-particle duality. Light is wave motion in ether. The claims of regressive physics are integral to the bamboozlement of the populace. It's part of the whole damn thing. And we're all fighting it. We have to have a revolution in our minds as well. And my idea of a revolution that stays is one in which everybody is on the same page. Everybody understands the same stuff. Right now, that's not happening. There's so much confusion. Even the physicists don't know what they're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. This is the good part. I know some controversy was raised here this afternoon by our two presenters, and from the reaction of some in the audience, I know this is your time now. So this is how I'll go. 1, 2, but keep your hand up. 3, the young man. 4, 5. That's the order we'll go in. Please.
So, I won't try to convince you of anything. Obviously, there's such fundamental differences between what I think and what you think that it would just take a long, long time. I'll just give you some of my thoughts hearing both of your talks. There are 3 main places. First, an overall. Almost every objection, I'm forgetting your name, the first speaker?
Mike Gimbel.
Professor Gimbel offered. Almost everything that you've argued comes from 18th and 19th century sources. None of it comes from, those are the same arguments that Berkeley had against infinitesimals and the analysts. These are very common, and that everybody had, including, as you pointed out yourself, Newton. Nobody accepts action at a distance. That's just a fallacy. That's not true. No scientists have ever accepted action at a distance, and they don't today. That's just not true. That's just a misunderstanding of science. And I've spent my life, I'm committed to studying these kinds of sciences. And I'm a Marxist. I completely agree with dialectical materialism. I don't see the two as opposed as you are, and I'm not going to make a big story about that. Most of your political stuff I'm fine with and I agree with. I just think you're just wrong about physics, you're wrong about math completely, the math especially, you're just wrong. That's shown, it's demonstrable. We have, now I'll go to the math, that's just about physics. The stuff about, the ether and all of this stuff, there's just empirical evidence about this, and I know I'm not going to convince you about it, and I know you probably read it, some of it, but you need to study the physics. I've studied the physics formally for many, many years, and I teach it, and you're just wrong. You're just not understanding how the physics works. But in the math, what you said about infinity is wrong. I mean, we have George Cantor in the 1870s has a whole theory of transfinite cardinals, and there's a whole mathematics of that. There are operations that you can do on transfinite cardinals. You're right. You can't do addition subtraction operations with integers or with natural numbers on them, but you can do other operations on them that are just as fundamental. In fact, they're more fundamental because they're related to classes and sets, which you could say, those are abstractions and what have you, and there's a lot of discussion about those things too in literature. I mean, every aspect of what you said, there's tons of discussion about, and to simplify it by kind of going back to simple 18th century models of what atoms are and what causality is supposed to be, I think is to treat historically, culturally bound conceptions of causality that did arise in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries as frozen in time and as absolutes in history. And those are conceptions that people have. They're not actual facts of physics. And it's just pointless to try to make them. What makes sense is to look at the empirical data and to look at how people struggle with systematizing that data. And I can't get into this now, but there's no question that, and to my mind, that relativity theory is a quite amazing systematization that does help us with that point that I brought up. I'm sorry to be so rude during your talk about the geometry of space, but we don't have to get into it right now. But you could say it.
Okay, Russ, you give them a chance
please,
to respond.
Before I get to the geometry of space, I would disagree completely with you on George Cantor. George Cantor tried to use the infinite, but his whole base of start of using it was incorrect.
And what was that?
You cannot, anytime you start to use a number, an infinite, you have to start from someplace, from one. At that point, you cannot, and I've looked at Cantor and stuff, and it's false. Why? Because anytime you use a number, you're already assuming a beginning.
Right.
Infinity has no beginning. When you use a number, you have to understand that it's infinite in all directions, that number. That you've just arbitrarily selected a spot. This is a little bit abstract, but the fact is that when you're dealing with the infinite, you're not dealing with George Cantor because his models are not the infinite. They're math. They are math. I don't deny that they're math, but they're not. They do not solve for the infinite. Okay. As far as the geometry of space, I'd love to see those that four-dimensional space where included angles of a triangle don't add up to 180 degrees.
Look at a globe. Look at the surface of a sphere. In the surface of a sphere, when you have
Okay,
Okay, one second.
You got to allow some dialectic
No,
here.
no, I understand.
And you have to allow
No, wait a minute.
One
Look
second.
at the sphere.
Wait, order please, order. Listen, excuse me, wait, I'm running the show here now.
This is left forum.
Everyone has to have a
That's what
chance.
the fascist for.
No, it's, I understand that, but the fact is, there's a time constraint, and you're not the only person here. We have others waiting. Give them a chance. All right? So don't interject. We can have a chance after they're finished for you to have another question.
It's not another question. It's
Well,
just
whatever
I know
it
you
is,
keep interrupting.
okay? It's interrupting. It's not
arrogant.
right.
It's arrogant.
Go ahead.
Okay? There's other
ahead.
people here. Before I was interrupted, let me just make this, there is no triangle of that sort.
Yes,
There are no
are.
bent straight
There are
lines.
triangles of that sort. That's a false thing.
Okay, let's go to somebody else.
Listen,
That's
sir,
it. That's it's
sir.
really.
You next.
I'm not a scientist. There are a lot of weird things in science, of course. But it sounds, to try to go, it was fascinating, it's crazy. Sounds to me the best I can do is that it's kind of Fred Hoyle steady state thing. Okay?
No.
No, okay,
Okay,
fine.
that's-
How do you deal with the things that I've read in my popular science about GPS doesn't function without relativity? You're just inaccurate.
False.
Okay, I got,
Let him finish
let's
his
do my
question. Go
four
ahead.
then, please. The atom bomb? How do you deal with that without energy inside the atom?
Yeah.
Do you, I'd just a curiosity, do you believe in galaxy formation? Or, okay, galaxy, that 13.7 billion years, has there been an evolution of the galaxies from something, whatever you believe it is? I'd be very interested to know. Do you believe in gravity? Do you believe in E equals MC squared?
Go ahead, take either one of you.
Okay, on the last one, E equals MC squared, I've got a paper on that. Do you want to know how that works?
E equals
It's on the website.
E equals MC squared is not relativity. In fact, it existed prior to Einstein. The galaxies form, the atom bomb is a mechanical device. I don't see where you get, it has nothing to do with relativity.
Why is pushing the red button?
No, it wasn't required for it.
Doesn't matter. It's matter in motion.
Yeah.
It's matter in motion.
And that's what E equals MC squared is. The gist of it is that the matter in motion inside the atom is being transmitted to outside of the atom. To what? To the ether. Okay? Now, if you're in ether denial, then you got to call it energy. a magical, matterless motion, okay? We're taught to believe that we have actually turned matter into energy, okay? And that's not true. We have transformed one kind of matter in motion into another kind. That's all we ever do.
Do you believe in energy?
Remember what I said that energy was. Energy is equals mc squared, and it is a matter motion term. It's a calculation.
So
It's not a thing.
If I throw a bullet at you, it'll bounce off. If I put it in a gun, it blows you away, right? All it is the matter in motion. It's not like the energy blows you away. It is the matter that blows you away.
I thought that C squared said, gee, there's an awful lot of energy there that's not in the matter if you don't bring in the energy inside the nucleus, the strong force.
You're doing that.
Okay.
Okay.
Next.
Young man?
Okay.
Yes?
So I actually wanted to discuss 3 of the specific claims about physics that were made, I think, by Michael. Specifically, the relativity of time, the claim that matter only exists in 3-dimensional space, and that Big Bang creation was creation from nothing. So, I don't know how much of the history of 20th century physics you've read about, but as it turns out, special relativity doesn't actually necessitate that time is relative. So Henri Poincaré and Hendrik Lorentz had a formulation of special relativity called the Lorentz ether model, which described all electrodynamical interactions in terms of a mechanical ether medium that one couldn't observe through, say, a Michelson-Morley type experiment. So it was consistent with Michelson-Morley. Subsequently, there are general relativistic extensions of the Lorentz ether model, which are consistent with all known predictions of classical Einsteinian general relativity. Einstein recognized this himself. In fact, later on in his life, he commented that his specific operationalist formulation of relativity couldn't be the end of the story because it doesn't give a causal account of relativistic phenomena like length contraction, time dilation. And so he actually, at the end of the day, sided with Poincaré and Lorentz. Now, also to add to that, we know from quantum mechanics, specifically the violation of Bell inequalities in quantum mechanics, that if you try and implement, say, an ontological formulation of quantum mechanics with relativity, we can't retain relativity of simultaneity. If you implement, say, hidden variables into quantum mechanics, which Louis de Broglie and David Bohm did, this actually results in a preferred foliation of space-time. So there is actually a notion of a universal present in this formulation, and you need it to account for the non-local correlations between spatially separated, space-like separated systems. And connected to this, the claim that matter only exists in 3-dimensional space. Well, precisely because of the violation of Bell inequalities, this is what really poses the greatest challenge to the claim that matter can exist in 3-dimensional space only. Because, well, essentially, if matter exists only in 3-dimensional space and matter propagates only at the speed of light, or that's the maximal speed, then we can't account for these non-local correlations. And in realist formulations of quantum theory, like the de Broglie-Bohm theory and other realist formulations, the configuration space that the wave function of quantum mechanics lives in is what's necessary to account for these non-local correlations. And in those formulations, you need to interpret the configuration space as something to do with an element of reality. It may itself be an element of reality, or may reflect something about reality in a more indirect way. But one can't naively just say that matter exists in 3-dimensional space and that's the end of the story, because then you can't account for these non-local correlations. And the third thing, the Big Bang as creation of matter from nothing. So, as someone who studies physics, I'm doing a PhD in theoretical physics. my understanding from a lot of cosmologists is that a lot of them aren't really satisfied with the Big Bang picture as the ultimate explanation of where the universe came from. And they readily acknowledge that. And nowadays, actually since the 1980s, it's been widely accepted that the Big Bang isn't the end of the story, and there are pre-Big Bang models like eternal cosmic inflation, which do allow for fields to exist before our universe and for quantum fluctuations on those fields to give rise to new universes ad infinitum. So the Big Bang itself is not in contradiction. Well, it doesn't necessarily itself imply creation of nothing. You can incorporate Big Bang model into an eternalist model like eternal cosmic inflation. And eternal cosmic inflation, by the way, makes very specific testable predictions, one of which was confirmed back in, I believe, the 1990s with regard to the spectrum of the cosmic microwave background radiation. So if you're not familiar with all of these aspects of modern physics that I'm talking about, I suggest reading about them, because I think if you study modern physics in depth, you'll find that there aren't really, except for this one particular aspect about matter existing only in three-dimensional space, there aren't really other major contradictions with the materialist philosophy we're talking about.
Who would like to answer?
Thank you.
18 different things.
Yeah.
I mean, it's easier, see, it's a problem. When you have a discussion,
Yeah.
if you throw out 18 different things, it's almost impossible to answer one of them. You know,
You guys are doing that.
I understand that.
Yeah, there's quite a few physicists are proposing multiverses, parallel universes, all of which is not oxymoronic nonsense. There's only one universe. That's what a universe is.
Based on what?
Okay, let me go through a little story here.
That's tautology.
Little story. At one time, they saw Andromeda. It was a galaxy, eventually proven to be a galaxy. Okay. At one time, these were all called island universes. Every one of the galaxies is called an island universe. Not so.
So what?
Not so.
What does that do with it?
Wait, guys, you're adults.
What I'm getting at,
Let him speak.
instead of being univarmental, which I was proposing, the microcosmic and the macrocosmic,
Okay.
what they're doing is like sort of jumping out of it. They're starting to get out of the pre-Copernican view, which is what the Big Bang is, pre-Copernican view of us, me kind of stuff. And so now they're getting out by proposing absurd things like multiverses and parallel verses. Now, remember I showed in our little thing there about a mega vortex as being the next stage in the universe, if it's hierarchical, okay, with no end to it. But we don't propose that those are multiverses or anything of the sort. And we're not proposing that this one was produced out of nothing or a singularity or anything stupid like that.
No, but what
First
I'm
of
just
all-
saying that modern physics doesn't make those claims. That
Well, they're backing off, is what I'm saying. It's so absurd. You look at how silly that's going to be. In another 100 years, we're going to say, how could they believe that flat Earth theory?
Well, what does that have to do with Big Bang
let me get-
cosmology, contemporary Big Bang cosmology?
Let me.
I feel like you're arguing against a straw man, which is this, very, very early
Well, you're-
in cosmology.
but
which is
much
not
of what
widely
you-
It's a
accepted.
cosmogony. We don't have a cosmogony.
But much of what you've stated had assumptions, your formulas are based on assumptions, which you don't agree with to begin with. The fact is that the speed of light is not a bar. And let me explain why. What you see right now. If you look at the sun, because light takes 8.3 minutes to get here, you're not seeing the sun where it is. You're seeing it about 20 arc seconds off. Can you, wait, let me answer it. I'm getting to it, okay? Please.
Go ahead.
But the gravitational effect of the sun is instantaneous. And yes,
In
which
which
means
in which
that the force carrying the gravitation its motion is extremely much faster than the light. And it's also not parallel with the
Who
light.
has that view? Where did you get that idea from?
It's just a question of clarification. I'm not
That's
trying
all.
to
Just want to know
interrupt
what.
you to
Well,
be combative.
Who has the view that the gravity travels faster than the light?
I do.
well.
Okay, okay, other.
No, many have complained.
Oh, yeah.
Name one.
The fact is, the effect of gravity on us sitting right here from the sun is instantaneous.
How
Is
do you know that?
Yes, because you can measure the direction of the gravity, of the effect. The fact is that and when you look at the sun, you're not seeing the sun where it is, you're seeing it 20 arc seconds off. Now, in addition, all these theories about the expanding universe, that the universe is expanding, that all your galaxies are moving away. For instance, Andromeda, you just brought it up, that's blue shifted. It's coming towards us. That cannot be, if all galaxies are moving away from us and Andromeda is moving towards us, that it makes no sense at all.
Well, there is a good explanation for that. I can tell you if you want.
Okay, wait.
But
You're next, sir. Your question. Let me ask you this. The next two people, and then I'll ask. It's 1, 2. Anyone else would like to ask questions after these two? You? Anybody else? Okay, go ahead, sir.
All right, I'm going to avoid physics per se.
Yeah.
I'm more concerned about the assertion of the title, and I think, Mike, you mixed, the political
Right.
theory with the physics.
Absolutely.
And I struggle. I mean, I am very interested in all these topics, and I think a lot of us are. And we realize there's a lot of importance here in these topics, and we're not. I think many people are uncomfortable with conventional understanding
Right.
of physics and of the theory.
Right.
And so my question is, you referred, Mike, to dialectical materialism,
Right.
and yet everything that you said, apart from the politics, where I can interpret dialectical to mean something to do with the program of the Russians or whatever, you never mentioned anything that sounded like dialectic. There was no dialectical aspect to what you were talking about in terms of the physics, and I don't think Glenn even brought up dialectic. It was purely about materialism. So I perceive this very one-sided presentation, which is just about materialism, sort of the polar opposite of idealism, which is not a dialectical combination to me. And in particular, Glenn mentioned that he disagreed with Engels because apparently both of you are full-blown determinists.
No,
Or
Each
is that-
of us
is that
is
No,
different?
I'm only determined
so
left, so.
I had a little hard time differentiating your points of view. Maybe that's just my misunderstanding. But to me, Engels was clear in some of his fragments that there's a dialectic of determination and chance. And to me, that's essential. Okay, this is my interpretation, because ultimately Marxism is still about it's still a project of freedom. It's still about liberating
Right.
us from class society.
Right.
And that means giving everybody the freedoms that only some select people have today. And to me, if science doesn't support that project, if it goes against it, and I see determinism as equivalent to faith. I agree with Ilya Prigozhin and others who see a world that is purely deterministic as a world that's equivalent to a world of faith, where basically there's a God or there is a set of universal laws that dictate what will happen, and that we'll all end up in this conversation where I'm asking you this question that may have no point at all, other than the fact that it was determined at some point in the past, whether it began at one point, which I don't believe, or it just ended up here. And I just don't see, I can't accept that kind of universe. So I think that along with all these other physical concepts that we should question, which you're questioning, and I applaud that, but I think we have to also question the whole notion of determinism. And then I think we may need to have a revolution in our minds as to what determinism means, and maybe it's not exactly the same thing as causation. Maybe there is causation that is grounded, that is negated, that is a negative causation, where the ground is fixed in something that exists, and yet the future is open.
philosophers have.
Yes.
By the way, I agree with you, because I'm not a determinist. Okay.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that.
Okay. And the basis of that, especially, is infinity. Because of infinity, you don't have a closed system, which is determinism. You have no way to cool down the universe, because you could take out all the matter you can grab and you still have an infinite amount of matter in the universe. Therefore, in the infinite universe is the opposite of a finite universe, where everything is governed by entropy and cooling down. In an infinite universe, it's governed by evolution. The universe continuously evolves because the general trend is for matter is based on gravity, and that things move towards each other, not the exact opposite of entropy of those who believe the universe to cool down. That in fact, in an infinite universe, because matter is infinite, because if space is infinite, matter is infinite. And therefore you can never, as much matter as you try to take out, it's still infinite. Meaning that since entropy does not govern, gravity does. And gravity has the tendency of pulling things together. Therefore, just like in evolution, going from lower to higher stages in evolution, it's the same for the universe. That in the basic function of gravity is to have greater and greater organization, not less organization as they do under the current theories, misusing the second law as entropy.
Well, I wanted to thank the professional scientists in the room for bringing up some of the key things, particularly the belly inequality, which it goes to the heart of some of this. But what I wanted to, my concern here is that there actually is an attack on materialism that is taking place in the world today, citing alleged things in modern science as a way of going at it, right? And unfortunately, our panel today didn't get at the heart of that. That's the problem, I mean, and I think that for example, some of us here have both studied modern physics, and we've actually read Materialism and Empirical Criticism, and I've even read Newton's Optics. But the heart of what I think is happening today is actually flowing out of Popper, for example. The idea that you can only disprove things, you can't actually establish anything as actually being true, and then that opens up the door to relativism, and who's to say that your idea is right versus my idea is right. This is a big philosophical problem that's used to attack dialectical materialism today. And the other aspect is positivism, which is what Lenin actually went after, in Materialism and Empirical Criticism, this idea that we can't really know the reality that exists behind the measurements that we take. All we know is the measurements, and these measurements, if taken, will predict those measurements over here. But who's to say that there's any reality that's out there? Again, it leads to an attack on materialism. Stephen Hawking, for example, in his most recent popular book, actually said in there that there's really no difference between the Copernican theory and the geocentric theory, because each of them can actually be used to correctly predict the relative position of planetary bodies. Right? You just add enough epicycles, and it's like a Fourier series, and you can get it as accurate as you want. But really, the planets do go around the sun. They don't travel in epicycles, right? So we actually need to actually try and look at what is actually happening today in the attack on the misuse of things out of modern physics, the misinterpretation of actual true things that are in modern science, their misinterpretation and their application to attempt to attack dialectical materialism. That was actually the panel that we needed today.
Any response?
I'm not sure I understand the
Well, you sort of couldn't understand where they're coming from, and like I had pointed out, I don't know if you were here, 80% of the people in the world are religious. The assumptions that are being used, and this is the problem. If you don't believe that these religious assumptions, like infinity and infinity, okay? A religious assumption happens to be infinity. That makes a big difference. And that's why the consciousness of physicists and so on, those items that you see in all of religion affect those thoughts. You have to believe it. And the assumptions are what I got at. That's why everybody should read these 10 assumptions at least. And you can go on Amazon and go pick up on and get more detailed description on that. But if you don't like those assumptions, go do some of your own. And like I said, they have to have opposites, and they have to have no way of proving them, Because why? Because the universe is infinite. We cannot prove, like if you really hope, you really think that we can measure and find out the causes for all effects, good luck. It's not going to happen. So that's an assumption. And I happen to believe it's true. You can call it law if you want, but I call it assumption for a reason, because that's what's the problem with the Big Bang and relativity. Wrong assumptions are being used. Those are religious assumptions. And anybody who has studied physics will be believing those assumptions. Because you don't get through. You don't work as a physicist unless you do. I know people who have quit the physics program because they couldn't stand it. It was disgusting to them. More than 3 dimensions, for crying out loud. What next? 13 string? Look at, waste your life on that kind of stuff? There's a revolution to be done.
Or fields without matter. I mean, this is contradiction in there is no possibility of having any kind of event taking place without matter. It simply is impossibility. All forces are push forces. And that's where I came up and tried to explain with the bouncing ball. Wait a minute. The fact is that in order to have curved space, you have to have matter to curve it. A ball in space cannot change, cannot go down. You see these designs, these things on TV where you have, they show in curved space the ball on the net and it comes down. Down is only under gravity. Down is only existing here on Earth. In space, there is no up or no down. In order for a ball in space, or an object in space, or a piece of matter in space, to go on a curve, it has to be being impacted by other matter. That's a basic law of physics. A body in motion cannot change its direction without being affected by other bodies in motion. And then, again, if you're postulating expanding this universe, what's on the outside? What's on the other side? It's a contradiction in reality. We have to, when we look at all these things, we have to ask, what is the material? To use the word force says nothing. It's not, it doesn't say, it hides everything under it. What you need to know when you look at the word, what is the force? What is the material that is carrying that change in motion? What happened to make it? When you jump up and come down, what is the matter that is impacting on you to make you fall down? You can't change direction on your own. You didn't just get tired moving up. There is explanations, but it must be based on physics of reality. That is matter in motion, because that's all that exists, is matter in motion. Time doesn't exist. Time is merely how we measure matter moving relative to other matter. And that's it. A day on Earth is based on the revolving of the Earth. A year revolving around the sun. A day on Mars or Jupiter, or a year on Mars or Jupiter are different. Time is no different. It's just a different way of measuring the motion of that matter around a particular object. Time is, there's this illusion that time is in that clock. The clock, whether it be the ticking clock or a cesium, is a mechanical object. There's no time in there. By the way, the claimed proof of Einstein using the two planes going back, one going one way and one going the other with a cesium in it, actually disproved relativity if you actually believed the clock thing. Because one clock was slowed, one was speeded up. When you go, the theory is you always return as the younger. You never come back as the older. But one of the clocks actually speeded up. So what it really to me showed is that there was a directional flow, just like you have in an airplane going, of the ether. One way you get it carried with you, one way it's against you. And it affects that material object. That cesium does not carry time in any case. It's a mechanical object. Time is merely how we measure the motion of matter relative to other matter, nothing more.
Okay, before I ask the last question, is there anyone who would like to, you would like the next, okay, anyone else who would like to ask a second question? No, oh, you
She's had her hand up for quite a while.
Okay, well, let's change this for a minute, George, hold on. If she had a hand up before and I didn't see, I'm sorry.
Sure, yeah.
You're next,
So
George, and then you, and then
This
you.
isn't meant to be a long question, but I want to ask a question and maybe respond to what
Right.
you say. So like, just to be clear, you're claiming that when the ball falls back down, it's because it's being pushed
Right.
by matter?
It's a push force.
So-
All forces are push forces.
So like, what is that matter? What is the name for that matter?
Well, to me, it seems obvious to me, the ether. What you're having is, it's not like where you go bang, like this. You're slowing until you get to equilibrium, and then you're coming back and speeding up. That means, by almost definition, you're not hitting one object. You're hitting lots of different things that slows your progress up, and then it hits the equilibrium, and that's those things that are hitting you as you move you down and speed you up as you're going down, because the accumulation of the hits from, and I'll call it the ether. Okay.
I mean, basically what I'm saying is that it's perfectly consistent. In fact, I can't think of a materialism that doesn't have as part of its materialism, as part of its theory, an understanding that there are both, let's say, physical, material and tangible entities, and then there are ways in which they interact, let's say.
Right.
So now we can name some, we can list like gravity or magnetism or whatever. But like, it's okay to be a materialist and for your, as we say in philosophy, ontology to include more than just actual physical objects, but also like the relationships that exist between them. And in fact, like if you were to really analyze your account of, I don't know if you want to call it gravity, if you want to give it another name, like take the story further, you still have to give an account as to why the ball stops coming back up and why that equilibrium, as you're calling it, changes, right? Like you still have to talk about like forces, let's say, or relationships, right? Because on the one hand, you're trying to say like, oh, well, there are these push forces, but on the other hand, you're trying to say like, it's just hitting other objects. And so that's kind of two different accounts, and then you have to.
Under, there was a 1742, and this, I'm not giving it as the exact answer, but it gives you a kind of an idea. Lesage theorized that his gravitons were screened. In other words, you're sitting on the Earth here. The mass of the Earth is screening the gravitons from that direction. So you're getting hit more from this direction where you're not being screened. And so therefore there's this imbalance. That in fact, gravity is that imbalance because and his formulas, which obviously were of that period, so they're not exact, did meet the inverse square law exactly, and they, in a general sense, give a sort of an answer. I can't give you more of a clear answer. I'm not trying to propose exactly. All I'm saying is, when you're dealing with matter, all forces are push forces. There's no such thing as a pull force. If I put a rope around you and pull on you, it's really a push force because of the rope that goes around you is pushing you. And every action that is where matter meets other matter, all these interactions are push forces.
So magnetic forces as well?
Yes. See, a force is, we use that word force because when we do not know the actual mechanical cause. We know the result. When you do F equals ma, you know the result, but you don't always know what that force is. You know, you give it the name energy, you give it whatever it is, but that's just a name for something where you're admitting you don't exactly know what the material action is happening. That what is it, what matter that is interacting with other matter, how you see the effect, but it's still yet to determine what it is, what the interactions are that are causing that.
Next question, and then the last question will be over
I
here.
have one question and one comment. I'll try and make them both brief. The Big Bang Theory, I remember reading about that, I don't know, 30 years ago. It made a certain amount of sense to me until I read an article, I think it was in Time magazine, that made it clear that there was a creationist thing behind that. So I recognize that, however, still needs to me to be an explanation. I'm sure there is one that I haven't heard or don't understand about the Doppler effect of the redshift and the galaxies. You can't get around it by just saying, well, one galaxy has a blue shift and it's moving closer to us if most of the rest of them are moving away. I just don't understand that. I've read a couple of things which didn't make sense. Just to comment very briefly, is one of the things that I give credit to Mike for is he made me reread at least portions of materialism and material criticism. I do not think that Lenin attacked relativity as such. He attacked the idealist view of the physicists who were seeing different kinds of matter and different kinds of matter in motion and put it in an idealist context. But I do not think he attacked relativity as such, and I don't even know if it was around at that point.
He was attacking Ernst Mach.
Yeah.
In reference to the redshift, where they postulate all these galaxies further and further and further away are moving faster and faster and faster away from us. And in fact, you go far enough, in fact, the speed, some of the galaxies have redshifts 4 times the speed of light. It's what you're, but if you look at it in a different way, it makes complete sense that they're not. That is, if light is a wave, it spreads out according to the inverse square law. It spreads out the inverse square. The further away from the source, the more attenuated the wave is. Therefore, if a galaxy is X distance away, the further away they'll be more redshifted. It is what it is.
It has to be moving away.
Doesn't mean that it's moving away.
How does attenuation change the
The
frequency?
radiated power is constant because the sphere's area increases.
Yeah, there's a difference between
frequency and attenuation.
Yeah. Constant, that's what
Yeah. It's just
Oh, you would be able to.
There's a difference between frequency and amplitude, is what I'm saying. The inverse square law applies to amplitude, it doesn't apply to the frequency. I'm just confused.
Well, change in frequency means you're losing energy, right, or motion, whatever, and that's what happens over distance.
Yes. You're not going to maintain the frequency over distance. You're trying to say that a wave in water, for instance, is going to cross the Atlantic Ocean and maintain its same frequency?
No.
That's not. That's
It
ridiculous.
doesn't have a frequency. What is it?
That waves. They both lengthen out and they lose.
What frequency?
Guy, you're gonna have your last question. Why are you interrupting?
That's how science is done.
No. This is, we gotta respect each other. Stop it. Okay? Come on. You want your question now? Go ahead.
All right. I'm actually a professional cosmologist.
Professor, what?
Cosmologist. My
Okay.
PhD is in relativity and cosmology. The Big Bang Theory, I think so. I think most people have the right idea. no one believes on a singular event or so on. This is sort of smoothing. And furthermore, even in any theory that actually solves the technical problem of producing a universe from some quantum state, everything's got to be finite or we jump the theory. That's what gravity is and quantum.
Speak up, so
Yeah, louder.
Sorry, so what I'm saying is when we have a theory, nothing will be infinite, or it's not acceptable. Gravity is not, you might have heard gravity is not quantizable. Yes, that's precisely because we try to quantize it. We get infinities, technical stuff, but, and that's not acceptable, okay? So, there are people in Canada who claim, we can get a finite volume, finite energy universe. Again, no infinities will be accepted. Okay? So it's not a problem of physics, right? So you just put that aside, whether you believe in Cantor or not, it's irrelevant to physics. Okay? Now, but anyway, I think he and you have both covered the physics well enough over here or something. But I don't know, to sort of brief, probably apply Oscar Wilde's in the face of injustice, attack is the best form of politeness or something. Well, so I'm going to be slightly impolite and say, this is actually retrograde.
Yeah.
Okay. This is, in fact, your narrative is even less coherent. Okay, than intelligent design narrative, which are actually they go really. I mean, they do have cash. They probably have more cash than you, and definitely less coherent than the global warming retrograde.
Deniers, yeah.
Okay, so this is actually retrograde. I'm just going to, everyone knows this, you're being polite, okay? I'm the scientist, sorry, I'm not sophisticated, I'm going to be impolite, right? This is retrograde, right wing, okay? I mean, this has nothing to do with dialectical materialism, right? Nothing
Against it. I agree.
It's not a force.
I agree. This is not gonna.
Okay. 4 o'clock. Our time is up. I'd like to thank you all for coming, for participating.